My name is Max Weaver, and this is my seminar on the causes of the French Revolution. The French Revolution has many roots, however, it can be deduced to a few major reasons, including intellectual, social, political, cultural, financial, and economic reasons. In this presentation, I will synopsize each of these categories and briefly go over every single one, starting with social inequality in France. So at the time, there were 24 million people living in France, and they were subject to a three-estate system. The first estate was known as the Roman Catholic clergy and consisted of 100,000 people. The second estate was known as the French nobility and consisted of 400,000 people. And finally, the third estate was made up of the common man, such as lawyers, peasants, merchants, and laborers, and they made up 98% of the population. However, the third estate was looked down upon by the first and second estate, and they were subject to different taxes, different rules, and different laws, which all made them question their place in French society. The first estate in France is known as the clergy. Although they only made up 0.5% of the population, they owned 10% of property and didn't have to pay any taxes at all. They also had the ability to collect tithes from the third estate. Tithes were essentially 1/10 of produce or earnings annually. So they were allowed to take this money from the third estate and put it towards the Church of France. The second estate also didn't have to pay very many taxes at all, and they were able to collect dues from peasants that lived in the third estate. The third estate was not subject to any of these privileges, and they had to pay extremely heavy taxes, and they were forced to pay their tithes and their dues. This burdened the third estate and made them question the three-estate system that was in place in France, and eventually led to them planning to overthrow this system. An important part of the third estate was the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie consisted of rich men and women in the third estate that began to gain influence as the French Revolution came about. So they developed a new class. Which had its own political agenda and ideology, which was to attain political ideology in France. The desire of the bourgeoisie to free themselves from royal and feudal encroachments on their liberty and property was a huge cause of the revolution. Alongside this, another very influencing factor for the revolution was philosophical thought at the time. In France at this time, philosophy was very well read by the common man, better than anywhere else in the world, especially in the third estate, where they were facing all this discrimination and unfair practices. And so a lot of the ideas of philosophical thought at this time really resonated with the third estate. So John Locke, Rousseau, and Montesquieu are all examples of philosophical thinkers of this time. For example, John Locke did not believe in governing without the consent of the governed. Montesquieu advocated for a system of separation of powers, and Rousseau advocated against all class systems. So due to the fact that the third estate was very enveloped in philosophy, they realized that these ideals did not coincide with what they were facing, and in fact, it was the opposite of what they were facing. So they believed that they should uprise, and it gave them justification to eventually overthrow this leadership in France. Another cause was the unnecessary and costly wars during the 18th century in France. So King Louis XV got into the 7 Years' War with Great Britain. This war was extremely costly, and they ended up losing the war. And after they had lost the war, he wanted to avenge his loss, so he built up an extremely large navy and created a coalition of nations that were anti-British. This really didn't help France at all, and it drove them further into debt and economic crisis, And the grandson of King Louis XV, King Louis XVI, joined in on the American Revolutionary War against Britain. And so, although they were supporting the US and the US won this war, they really didn't gain much at all. In fact, they lost more than they gained, arguably. They lost 1 million French citizens, and this was an extremely large loss at the time when compared against the total population of 24 million. So this further drove France into economic debt, and it was placing more of a burden on the Third Estate. So following this, there was a series of poor harvests in France due to the eruption of the Laki volcano in Iceland. This caused a series of very cold winters and droughts, which made it very hard for farmers to grow their crops in France, which led to them not being able to produce food for themselves or income to pay the taxes that they were facing. In 1887 and 1888, they faced another series of poor harvest, and this only trapped them further in economic debt and only increased tension in France as they were starting to not produce enough food and they weren't producing enough money to pay their debts to the First and Second Estates. So this caused the price of flour to increase in France. So for the First and Second Estates, it wasn't an extremely large deal because they had the money to pay, but the flour and bread consisted of 90% of annual purchases for people in the Third Estate. So when pretty much their main supply of food increased drastically in price, they weren't able to buy as much, and it created a famine in the Third Estate, which certainly increased tension, and they wanted to look to the king for help. However, he implemented the deregulation on the grain market, which didn't help at all. He was also not able to bring together conflicting parties to reach a reasonable solution to solve the financial crisis in France, and King Louis XVI implemented radical reforms. However, they failed miserably, and people began to look at the king in a very critical manner. Several French ministers proposed tax reforms, which would cause every estate to pay taxes, and it would take some of the financial burden off the Third Estate, and it would start to bring France out of debt, which would have been, really good for France at the time. However, the courts that these reforms had to pass through were corrupted by the First and Second Estate. So every time these bills were introduced to help out the Third Estate and to impose taxes on the First and Second Estate, they were shut down. So they were not able to get those reforms through and help the famine and poverty going on in the Third Estate. So what finally pushed the Third Estate over the edge was the extravagant expenditures of the king. He started reforming, he started remodeling the Palace of Versailles, which was almost seen as disrespectful and wasteful to the people of the Third Estate because they were sitting in famine, they were sitting in debt, and they're watching the king remodel palaces. And so it was really insulting to the Third Estate, and it pretty much represented how the king felt about them. So this in turn led to national unrest and ultimately the revolution. So all in all, these intellectual, cultural, social, financial, and economic reasons gave the Third Estate a multitude of reasons and plenty of justification to revolt, and overall compounded upon one another to lead to the French Revolution.